arguments are unavoidable. They happen with partners, friends, coworkers, even family. But here's the truth: arguments don't have to be destructive. The way you argue can either build respect or break trust. If you know how to argue without damaging the relationship, you actually walk away stronger, not weaker. Tension rises in an argument. The very first instinct most of us have is to fire back. It's automatic. Someone says something sharp, and before our brain even fully processes it, our mouth is already moving. The problem is that first response is usually fueled by emotion, not thought. And when emotion is driving, logic is in the back seat. And the relationship often pays the price. That's why pausing before reacting is such a powerful skill. It sounds simple, it changes everything. Think about it like this: when you hit pause, you give your brain a chance to catch up with your feelings. You buy yourself a few seconds to choose a response instead of falling into a reaction. And that's huge because reactions are impulsive while responses are intentional. Reactions are about winning the moment. Responses are about protecting the relationship. Pausing doesn't have to mean sitting in silence for an hour. Better, sometimes it's just taking one slow breath before you speak. Sometimes it's saying, "Give me a second, I need to think about that." Sometimes it's walking into another room to reset. The pause can be small, its impact is massive. That little gap between what they said and what you say next is where maturity lives. Here's what happens: when you don't pause, you mirror their energy. If they come in hot, you come in hotter. Voices rise, get sharper, and suddenly you're not even talking about the original issue anymore. You're just trading blows. When you pause, you break the chain reaction. You stop pouring gasoline on the fire and start calming the flames. Pausing also shows the other person that you care about what comes out of your mouth. It's a form of respect. It signals, I'm not just here to unload on you. I'm here to communicate in a way that actually matters. And people feel that. Even if they're heated, they notice when you slow the tempo instead of matching their volume. It softens the whole exchange. Now, pausing isn't easy, especially when you feel attacked. Your body goes into defense mode, and everything in you wants to clap back. But here's the truth: you say in that first burst of emotion will sound the way you want it to. You'll either exaggerate, say something unfair, throw in words you can't take back, and those words can cut deeper than the original issue ever did. When you pause, you give yourself a chance to respond in a way you won't regret later. And that's the goal: not to win the argument in the moment, to walk away from it without damaging the relationship in the long run. That pause is the difference between saying something destructive and saying something constructive. It's the difference between escalating and resolving. So the next time you feel your pulse rise in an argument, remind yourself, hit send, yet take the pause, reset. Because that pause isn't weakness, it's control. Control is what keeps the relationship stronger than the argument. When we argue, it's so tempting to make the other person the problem. Instead of saying, "This situation frustrates me," we say, "You frustrate me." And just like that, the fight shifts from solving a problem to defending an identity. The second you attack the person instead of the issue, you've lost the chance at a productive argument. Because no one listens when they feel attacked, they defend. And when they're defending, they're not hearing you. Building walls. Focusing on the issue means zooming in on what's actually wrong, not on who's to blame. If you're arguing with your partner about being late, the issue isn't that they're careless or selfish or don't value your time. The issue is simply lateness. A let for the better. If you make it about them as a person, they'll fight to protect their character. If you make it about the behavior or the situation, you're giving them room to see it clearly without feeling like you've ripped into who they are. Think about the difference between saying, "You're so irresponsible," versus, "When you're late, I feel unimportant." One blames the person, the other points to the behavior. One invites a counterattack, the other invites understanding. Same frustration, completely different result. This shift matters because identity is sacred to people. The moment you label someone lazy, selfish, uncaring, they stop engaging with the conversation and start engaging with your label. They'll throw the spotlight back at you. "Oh, yeah? What about when you?" Now you're in a spiral of character attacks, and the original issue is buried under a pile of insults. No one wins that. By keeping the focus on the issue, you turn the argument into a problem-solving session instead of a character assassination. You both stay on the same side of the table, looking at the problem together instead of at each other as the problem. That subtle shift keeps the relationship intact while you work through the conflict. It also communicates respect. You separate the issue from the person. You're saying, "I care about you enough to not confuse who you are with what happened." And that matters because respect is the safety net in every argument. People can handle disagreement. They can even handle anger. They can't handle is disrespect. That's what cuts the deepest. Of course, this doesn't mean you ignore patterns of behavior. If the same issue keeps happening, you still need to address it. Even then, it's about the pattern, not their worth as a human being. You can say, "This keeps happening, and it's affecting me," instead of, "You'll never change." One leaves the door open for growth, the other slams it shut. Line is this: argue the problem, not the person. If you keep the conversation locked onto the actual issue, for the better, you can fight hard, disagree strongly, and still walk away respecting each other. But if you make the person the problem, the relationship becomes collateral damage, and no argument is worth that. Most arguments turn ugly because of the way we start our sentences. We usually begin with, "You always do this? You never listen? You make me feel this way?" And here's the problem with that. You lead with you. The other person feels accused. And when someone feels accused, they stop listening and start defending. It's not that what you're saying is wrong. It's that the way you're saying it makes it impossible for them to actually hear you. That's where statements come in. Instead of pointing the finger, you turn the spotlight on yourself. You shift from blame to expression, saying, "I feel hurt when this happens." Sounds completely different from, one invites a conversation, the other invites a fight. Think about it like this: Arguments are already charged with emotion. If you add accusation on top of that, you're stacking dynamite. When you use I statements, you diffuse the tension before it explodes. It's not weakness, it's strategy. You're not softening your message, you're delivering it in a way that doesn't push the other person into a corner. And when people don't feel cornered, they're more open to hearing your perspective. For example, let's say your partner interrupts you during a story. If you say, "You're so rude, you never let me finish," they'll either deny it or shoot back with something about your habits. But if you say, "I feel frustrated when I can't finish my thought," you're making the exact same point without making them the villain. You're expressing the impact instead of assigning a label. And that's a huge difference. I statements also keep the focus on your emotions, which are undeniable. Someone can argue with your opinion. They can't argue with how you feel. If you say, "I feel ignored when my messages don't get answered," that's your reality. They might explain or clarify. They can't say you don't feel ignored. By framing it this way, you put the truth on the table without setting the other person on fire. This approach also builds trust because it shows you're owning your feelings instead of dumping them on someone else. It's easy to blame. It feels good in the moment to say, "You did this to me." But blame closes doors. Ownership opens them. You frame it with I. You're showing maturity. You're saying, "I'm not here to attack you. I'm here to explain me." That's an invitation to work together instead of fight each other. Now, let's be real. Using I statements doesn't magically fix every argument. If the other person is already defensive, they might still react poorly. But here's the thing, you can only control your side of the conversation. And choosing I over you means you're doing your part to keep the argument constructive. It's like setting the stage for resolution instead of escalation. At the end of the day, words matter. The difference between "you always" and "I feel" is the difference between starting a war and starting a dialogue. Arguments don't destroy relationships. Accusations do. And I statements are how you keep the door open for understanding in the middle of conflict. Most of us think we're listening when in reality, we're just waiting for our turn to talk. In an argument, that habit becomes a disaster. Instead of hearing what the other person is really saying, busy rehearsing our comeback in our head. And when we finally speak, answering a version of their words that only existed in our mind. That's not listening. That's preparing to win. Arguments fueled by winning usually end with both sides losing. Active listening flips the script. It's not just about staying quiet while the other person speaks. It's about giving them the feeling that you actually heard them. Because here's the truth, most people in an argument aren't desperate for you to agree with them. Desperate to feel understood. And the second you give them that, their defenses drop and the argument becomes a conversation. Active listening looks like eye contact, nodding, or even simple verbal cues like, "I get that," or "Okay, I hear you." But the real magic is in repeating back what you heard. If they say, "I feel like you don't spend enough time with me," and you respond with, So you're saying you feel a little neglected lately. You're showing that you're not just hearing sounds, you're processing meaning. That reflection alone can calm half the tension because it tells the other person they don't have to keep fighting to be understood. The tricky part is getting out of your own head long enough to do it. Because while they're talking, you'll feel that itch to defend yourself. That's not true. Or, but what about when you? Resist that urge. Finish. Remind yourself understanding is not the same as agreeing. You can listen fully, repeat what they said, still hold your life for the better, and still hold your own perspective. You're not surrendering. You're creating space for both sides to breathe. Think about how powerful it feels when someone listens to you without interrupting. You walk away feeling lighter if nothing got solved. Why? Because being heard is validation, and validation is what turns down the heat in any argument. Active listening is just giving that gift to the other person, even when you don't feel like it. There's also a bonus. When you listen actively, you actually learn more. Arguments usually reveal what's under the surface, what someone really values, what they're afraid of, what they need. If you're only half listening, you'll miss that. But if you tune in fully, you'll catch the deeper message. That's where real resolution starts, not at the surface level, but at the heart level. Of course, active listening requires humility. It's choosing patience over pride. It's deciding that understanding the other person is just as important as proving your point. And that's not easy, especially when you're angry. But here's the payoff. When people feel heard, they're more willing to hear you. Listening actively doesn't silence your voice. It amplifies it by creating an atmosphere where both voices can matter. At the end of the day, arguments aren't just about words, they're about connection. If you can make someone feel understood in the middle of conflict, you're already halfway to resolution. Active listening is the bridge that keeps the relationship standing even while the two of you are on opposite sides of an issue. Arguments usually feel like a tug of war. Two people pulling in opposite directions, each trying to drag the other to their side. The harder you pull, the harder they resist. And after a while, you're both exhausted, frustrated, standing even further apart than when you started. But here's the thing, it doesn't have to be a tug of war. Finding common ground flips the game. Instead of pulling against each other, you shift to standing side by side, facing the problem together. That shift changes the whole tone of an argument. Common ground doesn't mean total agreement. It doesn't mean you suddenly see eye to eye on everything. It just means you intentionally highlight the areas where you do align. Maybe you disagree on how money should be spent. You both care about financial security. Maybe you argue about parenting decisions. You both want what's best for your kids. That shared foundation is the anchor that keeps the argument from drifting into dangerous waters. You call out common ground in the middle of conflict. It creates reassurance. It reminds the other person, hey, we're not enemies here. We're on the same team, even if we see this differently. And that reminder matters because arguments often make people feel like they're fighting alone. Acknowledging shared values or goals pulls the tension back into perspective. It can be as simple as saying, "Look, I know we both want this project to succeed or care about keeping this relationship strong." Those words don't solve the disagreement, but they soften the edges. They send the message that the relationship matters more than the argument. And that truth is what makes people more open to compromise. Finding common ground also builds trust. It shows you're not just out to win, you're out to connect. When you acknowledge alignment, you demonstrate that you're listening, you're fair, and you're willing to see more than just your side. That humility often inspires the same in the other person. Conflict doesn't have to be a battle of egos. It can be a collaboration toward a solution. Of course, finding common ground requires intention. In the heat of an argument, your brain will want to spotlight the differences, want to magnify the gap. You have to train yourself to scan for overlap instead. Ask yourself, we both actually want here. What value are we both protecting? When you identify that, you pull the focus away from division and toward connection. And here's the hidden benefit. When you agree out loud on even a small thing, it creates momentum. Agreement is contagious. Once you find one point of alignment, it becomes easier to find the next. Slowly, the tug of war eases, and the conversation becomes less about pulling each other apart and more about building something together. At the end of the day, arguments will always highlight differences. That's the nature of disagreement. Relationships survive not because of perfect agreement, but because of remembered unity. Finding common ground is how you remind each other that beneath the conflict, there's still connection. And that reminder is often all you need to keep the argument from tearing the relationship apart. Every argument has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And while you can't always control how it starts or how heated it gets in the middle, you can decide how it ends. That decision makes all the difference. Ending with respect is what protects the relationship from being damaged, even when the argument itself was tough. Because at the end of the day, people don't just remember what you said. They remember how you left them feeling. Respect in an argument doesn't mean you suddenly agree or sweep everything under the rug. It doesn't mean pretending the conflict never happened. Respect simply means choosing to close the conversation in a way that still honors the other person's dignity. Might sound small, but it's powerful. It sends the message, even if we don't see eye to eye right now, I still value for the better. This argument doesn't erase that. The danger comes when we let arguments end in silence, sarcasm, stone walls. Walking away without acknowledgement leaves the other person feeling dismissed. Throwing in a last jab leaves them wounded. Slamming doors or cutting off communication leaves scars last longer than the disagreement itself. Ending with respect avoids that damage. It's the difference between a bruise that fades and a cut that leaves a mark. Respect can sound like, I still love you, even if we're not resolved yet. It can look like a calm tone instead of a sharp one. It can be as simple as, thank you for telling me how you feel. These small actions are not about losing power in the argument. They're about protecting the bond underneath it. When people know the relationship is safe, they can handle the disagreements inside of it. Sometimes Ending with respect also means taking a pause. If emotions are still high, it's okay to say, I don't want to say something I'll regret, so let's come back to this later. That statement is respect in action. The relationship above the rush to get the last word. You're acknowledging that resolution matters, so does the way you treat each other in the process. The truth is, respect is often tested most in moments of conflict. It's easy to be respectful when you're getting along. But when you're upset, frustrated, disappointed, that's when respect really counts. Choosing it in those moments proves that the relationship is stronger than the disagreement. It shows that you can argue hard without tearing each other down. And here's the part people often forget. Arguments come and go, words linger. Long after the heat of the moment passes, the tone of respect else or disrespect echoes. You don't want someone replaying the worst thing you said in anger. You want them remembering that even in conflict, you still treated them as someone who mattered. So when the conversation winds down, choose respect, because it fixes everything instantly, but because it keeps the door open for healing, understanding, and moving forward. Disagreements will pass, but respect, that's what makes sure the relationship lasts. At the end of the day, arguments aren't the enemy. They're a normal part of any real relationship. What matters is how you argue better. If you can pause before reacting, focus on the issue instead of the person, instead of you. Listen to actually understand, look for common ground, and make sure you end with respect. You're not just surviving conflict, you're strengthening connection. The argument doesn't have to tear you apart, it can actually bring you closer. Because when both sides feel valued, disagreements can build trust. That's the real win.